Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 12. My name is Eric the IT Guy Hendricks, and today we're going to be talking about sudo and su, so different ways to administer your Red Hat Enterprise Linux box. Joining me today and every day in the month of March is my esteemed co-host, Scott McBrien.
Hello.
All right. So if you've been following along, we've pretty much done all of these systems from root. We're going to switch things up today, and we're going to start with our friend Tony, who's been making cameo appearances throughout the show. And Tony is a regular user so he only has access really to a certain number of commands, and mostly only has access to his own home directory. So on most systems, that's /home/Tony in this case, but we'll say that Tony is a systems administrator who needs to do some more privileged tasks, maybe modifying his network stack on the server or something along those lines. So the most direct way to do that is to log in as your user account, in this case Tony, and then do what's called an su command, a switch user command, and then put in hyphen and then root. Actually, you don't need the root. That's mostly if you're suing to a different user account. So if you do an su hyphen, that will su into the root account, which is switch user. And at this point, you need to put in root's password. That's the caveat here. Keep that in mind for later on in the episode. But if you do an su command, you need to know the password of the user you're switching to. So now you see that our prompt has changed and we're logged in as root. So we can actually do different administrative tasks at this point as the root command. However, as we'll get into a little bit in the deeper dive in this episode, you may not want people logging in directly as root for certain reasons. But if we do a Control D or an exit, that'll actually take us back to our previous user, which is Tony. But if we do an ID on our user account, that'll list the groups that we have membership for. And you notice that we are user Tony, and we're a member of the Tony group. But if you look across to where Scott is highlighting, you'll notice that we're also a member of the Wheel group. The Wheel group dates back quite some time. I'm pretty sure it found its roots in Unix. But the Wheel group is basically an administrators group. So if you come from a Windows or Windows Server administration background, this is essentially the administrator group on Windows. And so what this does is it gives us the ability to use a different command called sudo. So it's a switch user do, which basically allows us to run individual commands as with privileged access. So if we do a sudo, and let's say Tony needs to update a package. So let's update the Apache web stack. So if we do a sudo dnf update, and then httpd. It will then ask us for our own password. This is one of the advantages to using sudo versus su. First off, you can use it as your individual user account. It's your own password, so you don't necessarily have to give out the root password to everyone. So if we type in Tony's password, then we'll actually see the DNF update kick off. So you notice that with using our own password, we can actually execute administrative tasks on this box without knowing root's password. Now, there are instances, though they're very rare, and maybe Scott can jump in on this, where you'd want a user to be able to have access to the root account, but you don't want to give out root's password. So there's an interesting trick where we can combine the two commands. We can combine sudo and su hyphen, and we can actually log into the root account with our own credentials. And you notice, as we mentioned in a previous episode, that there's actually an I believe it's an agent that runs that for a certain amount of time has cached our password, so it didn't prompt us for a password again. But that agent has a timeout to where if you don't use the sudo command within a certain amount of time, it will re-prompt you for that password. Scott, I did a lot of talking there. I'm sorry, but you have anything to add on the critical path before we move ahead?
No, I think we're ready to transition, Eric.
Awesome. So before we move on to talking about sudo, uh, I know I've used sudo su from time to time. Do you have any use cases off the top of your head? I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but any use cases where that might be useful?
Um, so sudo on its own, right? You have to run every single command wrapped in that sudo, right? So if you're trying to do a whole bunch of things as root, it's rather inconvenient to like sudo this, sudo the next thing, sudo the thing after that. So when you're doing something more complex like that, a sudo su dash will be will allow you to become root, and then you can just run the series of commands that you need as the root account. Um, but notice that, or we haven't talked about it yet, but all the stuff that we do with sudo does get logged. So if you're sudoing individual commands, those individual commands are shown with the log. If you do a sudo su dash, then the su dash is what shows up in the logs, but none of the additional commands you run during that su session will show up there. So it's kind of an accountability, maybe some auditing type stuff that one would choose one way or the other. But towards the end of the episode, I think we'll talk about a technology that makes that gap a lot smaller.
Mhm.
Um, but that's why I've seen it used as accountability versus freedom to execute things as root.
Right. On one hand, if you're using su or sudo su, you end up having to then backtrace. Well, this this change or this unusual activity started around 3:24 p.m. And if I backtrack in the logs, I noticed that Tony happened to log in to the root account at 3:19 or something. So it's a little bit more investigative work one way versus another. But in the end, there's multiple ways to do this, and we're going to cover a couple of those next. But as you were talking, it actually dawned on me. I have used sudosu in a previous life as a systems administrator for things like say the Apache account. So um, if I need to make some changes to the web server, instead of giving me root access or instead of having the it's the www.data account, I believe, on RHEL. Instead of giving me those passwords, I can use a sudo command and then a switch user, and then I can switch over to a service account to do service account things. Um, in fact,
Yeah,
that's a
and
good place. Go ahead.
the other thing that one would save from allowing people to su with sudo versus individually writing all the commands they can do is the complexity of your sudo configuration is a lot smaller if you let them
Hmm.
su to become another account. If you're
Right.
going to control what commands they have access to, you have to do a much more significant configuration of sudo to better map out what that command set is. Whereas with su, allowing su in that command set, you then grant them access to the full root equivalency in their account. But you pay the price of less accountability, less tracking, but you also have less configuration to manage and maintain over time.
Yeah, and when we pull up the sudoers file here in just a minute, it's one of those things that can very very quickly get out of hand. And as the chat points out, the configuration file isn't exactly the most um, um, user friendly. Um, so one more thing about the su command is that the su hyphen means we're going to connect to the root account, and but if you do an su hyphen and then say Jill is another user on our account, we can actually change user to another user, whether that's Jill's account or whether that's a service account. We can actually su to Jill as long as I've got a hair on my nose.
Thanks for
Sorry,
sharing, Eric.
I didn't want people to
Oh,
think I'm just over here picking my nose. Anyway, I'm sorry. uh, But as we mentioned, using the su command on its own requires us to know the destination account's password, so we'd have to know Jill's password, versus sudo su, where we'd have to know our own password and have the ability to use the su command. All right, moving right along.
I
Past.
do have one other
Good.
thing about SU. All right, so you can also SU without the dash, right? Like here, I'm putting root's password, and I'm root, right? except I'm not entirely root. So the dash option to SU says that you want to re-execute the target user's login shell environment. So you'll notice that when I use SU without the dash, I'm not in root's home by default, I'm in Tony's home, right? Because all I did was change my effective user ID to be root, but I left all the other environment variables for Tony intact. So I'm operating with Tony's shell environment with the power and privileges of root. Whereas with the dash, I re-execute all of the bash environment scripts as root. So I not only operate with root's authority and ability, but I also operate within root's shell environment. So that's a pretty important distinction. Um, and to that effect, I would say like 99.9% of the time you want to use the dash, and very rarely do you want to skip it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so we mentioned the wheel group at the top of the show. Let's go ahead and take a look at the privileges for the wheel group. So let's first do, say, a sudo group wheel just to see who all has access to the wheel group.
Actually, I think we can just say oops wheel.
Oh, that's true. We are a member of the group.
Man, it's a long day.
Ooh,
How do we do this? Wheel.
yeah, we may just have to grep the etsy groups file.
There you go.
Okay, so we've got a RHEL account on this box that we use for different demos, and then we've got Tony. So those two accounts have access to or are members of the wheel group. So we get to use the sudo command for just about anything while using our password. And where we look that up is in a file called etsy sudoers. However, it's highly recommended that you do not do a VI to etsy sudoers. There's actually a command line utility called vi sudo that we can use to edit that file. And so what sudoers is it is the configuration file that the chat was talking about. And off the top of your head, it might be difficult to understand what each of these different stanzas do. So Scott has highlighted the wheel group. So the difference between a user, say root at the top of the screen, and a group is the percent sign. So no percent sign means that that's a user. The percent sign indicates that we're referencing a group. So the all equals all is the configuration syntax for any command on the system I want to include in this group, and we'll talk about a little bit different approach here in just a minute. And then the all is the list of commands that require password authentication. So if we look down a couple of lines, there's actually a configuration line commented out that says no password : all. And so this is an alternative configuration. So there may be times when maybe it's a service account where you're running configuration scripts or automated tasks where you don't want that task to be interrupted by a password prompt, where you might want to use the no password option. And so what this does is it grants your account the ability to let me back up. What no password does is it means it gives you the same access with sudo that you'd have that we've demonstrated with Tony. However, the no password option means that you're not going to get prompted for your own password for that list of commands. And in this case, all the commands we have access to in that center column, we are not going to get prompted.
And I just wanted to point out, Eric, that the wheel group configuration that we see up here is the default for this file. So when you install Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I think 7, 8, and 9 beta, this is in there by default. That members of the wheel group are able to use sudo by providing their own password. And you see this a couple different places in the distribution as well. So if you are installing the machine, like we saw in a previous episode, there's an option to select whether you want the user account that you're creating during the install to be an administrator.
Yes.
Or if you are doing the first boot setup and you're adding a user there, there's a little checkbox that says allow user to be an administrator. What you're really selecting when you check that box and say allow them to be an administrator is it's going to add that user to the wheel group, because the wheel group exists by default in our standard sudoers file on RHEL.
Great question, or great point. Um, Speaking of questions, I wanted to address Shantanu. I think I got it right this time. Let me know if I didn't. Um, and Shantanu brings up a good point that sudoers is not sensitive to tabs or spaces. Um, and then the next question I wanted to address here was from Luna. No password is no password kind of insecure. Kind of. And I say kind of
So,
because uh, you have to use your password or an SSH key to get logged into the box. So you are authenticating at one point. The trade off is you're not having to re authenticate yourself. So you could be, shall we say, forced to log in using your credentials, and then someone else could hijack your session, or someone else could take your place at the keyboard and um, uh, then someone um, could start to make changes to the system. So it's kind of a re-verification. And so with everything security that we talk about, whether it's firewalls, SE Linux, user permissions, it's all a trade-off between convenience and security.
yeah, and the more checks that you have, the more auditing you put into place, the better posture you'll be in. So there's a reason why the wheel group definition that I have highlighted is the default and not the one later that's set as no password, right? Because if you allow someone to do root things without providing any kind of authentication, as Eric says, that means that someone could consume one of their sessions and start doing things as root. And that session might be a tmux session that we talked about in a previous life. It could be they walked up to that person's computer and saw that it was logged in. Like there's a whole bunch of avenues that become potentially problematic by allowing people to do things as no password. The flip side to that is it's really convenient to do things without a password, because then you're not asked to put it in all the time. Um, so it's a balance, and it's up to
Yep.
the administrator running the box and the organization who owns that box to decide what the best route is.
Like I've got some systems here in my home labs that I've got a couple that are specifically only there to do convert to RHEL or in-place upgrade demonstrations. And so I do no password because I don't want to have to type my password 16 times during a live demo. But if I have a system that's running my company's production banking software or something that's exposed to the internet, and I have people logging in and out all the time, I'm probably going to lean more towards the security route. Okay, kind of went off script there, but I think that's a good conversation to have. And okay, so we actually have another user on the account. Um, we have a gentleman named Pedro, and he is not a member of the wheel group, as you might recall. And so we want to add a sudoers entry for him. And so we mimicked the default configuration, and we added his name. So it's Pedro. He has access to all the commands on the system, and a password reprompt is required for all of those commands. So if we go ahead and exit out of here, and if we log into Pedro, then we can run a command. I should have given us an example here. We could do another DNF update or something along those
How about
lines.
we restart a service?
Let's do that. Actually, we have HTTPD on the system. Why don't we restart that? So you notice, just like Tony, it allowed us to restart HTTPD, but it did prompt us for Pedro's password. The only difference is that we did this based on user permissions versus group permissions. So if you have a one-off contractor or something, you may want to give specific permissions to that user. And if we go ahead and go back to root and re-enter vi sudo, we can actually set that up. But it's much easier to do this using groups, because this might be a database server and a web server, so it might be a LAMP stack all in one box, a Linux Apache MariaDB or MySQLDB and PHP server. So it may just be a basic web server, and we have web administrators on the box, we have DBAs on the box, database administrators. Then that would allow us to say that the DBAs have access to a certain set of commands with sudo, whereas the web administrators have access to a different set of commands. So you see how we can really start to build our security for our users in layers. And that's what we want. We want a layered security approach. You've got systems administrators that usually have run of pretty much the entire system, but then after that, we want to start kind of narrowing down what commands that we want to use. So far, we've been using the all configuration, but what we can actually do, and we've got a third or fourth user on the system, I lost track at this point, named Jill, who we can actually specify to only have certain access to certain commands. So Jill in this situation is a member of the networking team, and we want Jill to be able to excuse me. We want Jill to be able to make network changes on the server. Maybe it's a change in subnet mask, or maybe she just needs to come in and bounce our network card. So what we can do is there's a third way of doing this that we're going to cover today. We're going to create a sudoers.d configuration file. So sudoers is our configuration file, our master configuration file. What we also have is we have a directory, sudoers.d, that's sudoers.directory, where we can create individual accounts for individual groups or individual people. So if we go ahead and VI into a configuration file that we're going to call Jill, because we're systems administrators and we want to make our lives easy. So we're going to specify Jill as a user. We're going to give Jill access to all the commands, or we're going to actually, I may have been saying that backwards. Anyway, we're going to give Jill access to only specific commands. In this case, we only want Jill to be able to restart the network manager service. So if we write this file, and then let's just, for the sake of showing, let's do an ls on sudoers.d. Because what we can do here with the sudoers.d directory is we can have multiple different users and groups in this directory. You notice that our lab is hosted on GCP, so there's actually a Google sudoers file here and the file we just created for Jill. So if we go ahead and move over to Jill's account, we can make sure that our configuration worked. Because I typed up the command ahead of time, so I may have fumbled it, but we'll find out. So you notice that it gives, the first time around, it gives us a little warning saying that, hey, great power comes great responsibility. Actually, that's rule number 3. I love it. There's Easter eggs in your Linux boxes. Go find them and share them in the comments. Think before you type, respect the privacy of others. Luckily, you only see that once. I'm sure all of us have read that every single time religiously. But there at the bottom, it asks us for Jill's password. And then when you're restarting service, no news is good news. So yes, Jill was able to restart the network service. But if we try to restart, say, the HTTPD service, we should get an error here. And I say should because we're live. So you notice that Jill is not allowed to execute that command. And in fact, what it's done in the background is it's logged to a log file that says, hey, this user executed this command at this time in violation of system policies. So Jill can't do anything on the system that requires administrator privileges other than restarting the network manager service. So you can very, very quickly see, one, that sudo files can very, very quickly run amok and come up with all sorts of interesting breaks for your system. But on the other hand, if it's well manicured, if you are very intentional about kind of a top down approach of giving people the absolute minimum that they need, you see that we can actually set up a very, very secure system where database administrators only can do database things, and systems administrators can't have to re-authenticate every sudo command that they run, so that we can verify that they're not going in and making system breaking changes because someone walked up to their desk in the middle of the workday and started making changes that they don't have access to. Scott, I feel like I've done all the talking here today. You have anything to add?
Um, no, I think it's all good stuff. I think that once you start down the route of sudo and controlling what users can do very finely, um, you'll figure out that there's more that they need to do than you think they do. So, for example, with Jill, um, she probably needs to do a status of network manager at some points. We'd have to put that in the sudoers file.
Mm-hmm.
And if she is actually a network manager and makes changes to the configuration, well, she probably needs an MCLI added to her list of commands,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like, you end up starting to get that kind of stuff. If instead it's just like, this is the overnight operator that manages your box, and you grant that person a list and they work off a script, then you can be a lot more
Prescriptive.
exactly. The other thing I wanted to point out is how we created Jill. So, so we created Jill with this extra file in etc sudoers.d, as opposed to adding a line for her in the etc sudoers file, right? Which would have been another route to solve the same problem. Um, and I have some ideas of why that is. Eric, do you want me to just spit it out there, or do you have some ideas of why
Go
that
for it.
is? So, when you're working with a complex configuration file like sudoers, where you put things in the file is challenging. And let's say that we went ahead and put Jill's line in there, and then at some point Jill left, and we needed to clean her line out. Doing that automatically around all the other stuff that might be in there is hard. Yet, removing the file that contained all of her rules, that's easy. Throw in there things like configuration file management technologies. Managing a file on a system and adding it or removing it or pushing a new copy of it, that's all pretty standard stuff now. Whereas trying to surgically edit a configuration file with automation, that can be really hard and is often challenging based off the different states that systems can get themselves into. So that's why it's not just sudoers, but a lot of other configuration stuff has a configuration directory. You can just drop a modular file to plug into the configuration framework.
Yeah, it really becomes easier to manage your system when you start up leveling where you put the complexity. So by keeping that sudoers file as default as possible really helps, especially leveraging the .d directory for those configuration files. Because what happens when all of a sudden we triple the size of our networking team and now Jill has 2 coworkers? Do we really want to go in and create a file for each of those people, or do we want to switch Jill's file up and create a network admins group on this box, add those 3 people to that group, and then set that sudoers.d file up instead of as Jill, set it up as network admins? So you can see how you can start out with just basics, but you can very iteratively make changes across your systems. And then if you've got 500 servers, you can use something like Ansible or some kind of configuration management or satellite to distribute those files across all of your fleet of servers. So it just, while you can get yourself into a tangled mess and it's a nightmare to try and troubleshoot, at the same time, if you're just very adamant about how you go about addressing those changes, it can be a blessing as a systems administrator to know that my network admins only have access to the network stack and the like commands. So we hinted that that Jill's infraction got logged into a log file, and that is under /var/log, which is pretty much where all the system logs live. There's a file called secure. And so if we look up, actually, yeah, right there underneath the command, we see that Jill ran a systemctl restart network manager. That one was successful. But let's see. So
So
yeah,
you're talking
about
about here at the top. That's the
right.
successful one.
Yep. And then if you go three lines up from the bottom, you'll notice that it says that Jill is not allowed on this terminal to run the system restart HTTPD. So this is what we were talking about throughout the show of your sudo actions being logged. So you can very quickly see that Jill's running commands that are successful, but also Jill is running commands that are getting denied. And so when you suspect foul play, this is a varlog secure with a grep command is a very, very easy way to go in and start seeing that, hey, so-and-so is either trying to do something nefarious, or maybe maybe this user just doesn't have the access that they need. So maybe Jill needs to manage HTTPD. Maybe she's not just a network administrator, but maybe there's a utility or something that the networking team uses on this box where we may want to add her to the web admin group, much like if we create a network admin group. So this gives you a really good way. This gives you a really good way to go in and see what's going on in your system. And if you don't do regular auditing of your systems, I highly recommend you start building that practice. And reviewing the varlog secure file on a regular basis is one way I'd highly recommend getting started.
So before we go, the one last thing I would tease on is we talked about how there are other methodologies of doing accountability. So an older way that's RHEL 7 and earlier would be using the audit D utility to do auditing. But with Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 and later, 8 and later, we include session recording as part of the distribution. And that is a really handy way for not only seeing what commands people are running during their sessions, including SU sessions, but also to see the commands in context. So like this successful Jill system control restart, what we're seeing is that she was able to successfully run this command, but we don't know whether the command was successful, right? Or did it produce an error when it was executed? And so session recording will let us see that additional context, which might be handy. So we'll cover that in a later episode, I think.
That's what I love about these 30-minute episodes. We always have more content to cover. But if you look into terminal session recording, there is a component within the web console, the cockpit console. Or if you look into tlog, you can actually replay sessions. This is great for doing pre-recorded demos, or like Scott was talking about, being able to basically audit a session. So we are at the bottom. We are past the bottom of the hour. But I'm sorry, Scott. I don't feel like I shared the spotlight. But sudoers is something that I had to I've had to introduce into a couple of companies that I worked at. But there's one in particular that had it done really, really well, and so I learned a lot from that experience. And so I guess it was something I was pretty passionate about. But
well, as we're coming to the end, don't forget to like this content if you enjoy it and you want us to make more of it. Share if you have a friend that you think would benefit from it. And you could subscribe to our Red Hat Enterprise Linux channel and get notified when we have live events like this one.
Definitely. And if you want to see this content again, Scott will be doing dark mode tonight. So join him for that. And we'll continue on tomorrow with talking about system firewall as we continue our daily month of into the terminal. So thank you so much for joining us live. Thank you all for all the questions and the comments in the chat. It really helps inform the content as we're recording it. So thank you all very much for joining us live. And if not, put your questions in the comments. Scott and I are pretty adamant about following up and making sure we get those answered. So until then, see you tonight for dark mode, or see you tomorrow morning when we talk about firewall. Thanks all.